Whoa! Boundaries, people! Like, you know? Well, since you're already in my kitchen, I may as well welcome you to another exciting visual effects tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use the Element 3D plugin from Video Copilot to create a really cool city fly-through scene and then have the camera enter into one of the buildings. In case you have not noticed yet, this is going to be part 4 of my 5-part tutorial series on how to create an epic camera zoom effect all the way from outer space, down towards the Earth, through a layer of clouds, revealing a city night scene below, and then off through another layer of clouds, down into the city and into a building. In the last part, in part 3, we created that scene where the camera transitions through a layer of clouds, revealing a city night scene below, and then off into another layer of clouds, down towards the city. In this part, we will have the camera emerge from the bottom layer of clouds, fly through a 3D model of a city and then enter into one of the buildings to transition into our final scene. For this, I am going to use the awesome Element 3D plugin and the Metropolitan pack from Video Copilot. Now, you can use a dedicated 3D package like Cinema 4D or 3ds Max to achieve the very same effect, and you can even find some free models of cities and buildings online. Personally, I like to keep my entire workflow inside of Adobe After Effects whenever possible, and the Element 3D plugin makes that really easy. I am going to put a link to the plugin as well as the Metropolitan model pack that we will be using for this tutorial down in the description of the video. Difficulty-wise, this is going to be an intermediate tutorial, but I will assume that you have watched part 1 to 3 of this tutorial series and have at least a reasonable understanding of what was going on. But enough of me talking, let's jump right into the tutorial. Here is a brand new empty composition set to a duration of about 20 seconds. Let's start by adding the 3D city into the scene. Add a new solid layer. I will call mine City and hit OK. Then search for and apply the Element 3D effect from Video Copilot to the layer. Go over into the effect settings and click the Scene Setup button. This will bring up the Element 3D interface. In the Models browser, I have a folder called Metropolitan. All models in this folder are from the Metropolitan model pack that you can get from Video Copilot. It contains some untextured models, some detailed building models, and, the ones we will be using, the no antenna version of the models. The main reason to use the no antenna versions over the full models is that they render significantly quicker due to the lower polygon count. In the Metropolitan pack you can find a ton of cool 3D models of city buildings like this fancy skyscraper here. Now, our city will have a lot of buildings, but I don't want to be adding them one by one. Instead, I will use these pre-built city block models from the Metropolitan pack. Because this is going to be a night scene, we want to use the night versions of these models, and let's check this one out. Looks cool! It's a fully pre-built city block with a variety of buildings already in place, and there's even a little plane for the street. We will use a number of different city block models to distribute on the ground plane to define our city. There's only one small issue with one of the city block models in the Metropolitan pack that I noticed, and this is the one here, Street Layout 02 Night. If I disable the model I added before and zoom in on the Layout 02 and just the corner of the model, you can see that the street does not actually align perfectly with the grid. This is going to be a problem if we use this model as one of the tiles for our city, so I will exclude the Street Layout 02 Night model from our scene. Let's remove this model from the scene browser and re-enable the first one we added. Yep, that looks much better. Can you see how well the streets align to the grid? This will work perfectly. Let me zoom back out and let's add all of the other city block models we want to use into the scene. This includes Layout 03, 04, 05 and 06. Now I am using Element 3D version 2 and so all of my models have automatically been grouped together. However, I do want all of my models to be treated as individual elements, and so I will select all of them and drag them out of the group folder. Finally, we can delete the empty group folder. Cool! Just make sure that all models are set to output to group 1 and then we're ready to create our city scene. Hit OK and you should see a single city block side on. Now, before we get stuck into it, do note that rendering can get quite slow even with a powerful computer. Performance has been greatly improved in version 2 of the Element 3D plugin, but if you add a lot of 3D models into your scene, things will eventually slow down. For now, let's set the render mode for the Element 3D plugin to draft to render it all out a little bit quicker. Next, in order to navigate around our 3D city, we need to add a camera into the scene. Create a new camera, and you can decide whether you want to use a 1-node or a 2-node camera. Personally, I think this fly-through is a little bit easier to create with a 1-node camera. So select the 1-node camera option, let's call this one actually camera, and then hit OK. With your mouse over the preview window, you can now use the unified camera tool, which you can toggle with the C key to navigate around your scene. Let's move the camera way above the city and look down a little bit. Make sure you're sufficiently zoomed out so that you can see the city appear, and then go back into the settings for the Element 3D effect. Expand the Group 1 tab and then open up the settings for the particle replicator. We want to distribute our city blocks on the ground plane evenly, forming a little grid. For this, change the replicator shape over to plane. Next, a single city block model won't cut it, and because we want to create an even grid of city blocks, we need to increase the particle count to the width and height of that grid. Let's say that we will make our city 12 by 12 blocks in size, so set the particle count to 12 by 12, which is 144. You may want to go with a smaller grid if your computer starts to struggle with rendering that many polygons. Now all we have is a blob of 3D models that looks more like a weird concrete coral as opposed to a city. To distribute these city block models, we need to increase the shape scale property in the particle replicator. Ah, cool! Doesn't that look much more like a city? Now, if you push the scale up too far, you will notice that you end up with all of these little gaps between the city blocks. Let's zoom the camera in a little so that we can see it a little bit more clearly. We need to get the shape scale set exactly right so that the streets connect seamlessly without overlapping. For me, that is around 220. Let's zoom in and check one more time. Yep, looks okay to me. If we zoom all the way back out, you may notice that our city looks a little bit too unnaturally regular. To some extent, this is a limitation of using the Metropolitan model pack as opposed to building your own custom 3D model of a city in a 3D program, but there are a few things that we can do to make this look a whole lot better. Go into the Element 3D settings, open up the Particle Look tab for Group 1, and then expand the Particle Rotation section. Under Randomize Angle, you can find properties that allow you to randomly rotate all models in your scene by a fixed random angle around the X, Y, or Z axis. Increase the Y rotation property to an exact 90 degrees, and what will happen? Element 3D will randomly rotate some of the city blocks by multiples of 90 degrees. This makes the city look a little bit more random and natural. It's still not perfect, but it'll do. If you're still not happy with the layout of your city, you can also tweak the random seed option in the Element plugin to generate different versions of your city until you find something that you like. Cool, I think I'm good with this one. Let's zoom in a little bit and set up the rest of the render settings for our city. First, before we start tweaking the render settings, let's switch the render mode back to full render so that we can actually see how the changes that we make affect the final image. It's looking quite nice, but the city looks rather flat at the moment. That is because we haven't added any lighting yet. Everything is very uniformly lit and very boring. In the Element 3D settings, expand the Render Settings tab. Under the lighting section, you can choose to use the lights that you have placed in your composition. Just to try to keep this tutorial to a reasonable length, I will go the cheap way and disable the Use Comp Light options for now. Instead, I will use one of the predefined lighting options from the Element 3D plugin. In the Add Lightings dropdown, you will find lots of cool lighting presets that you can toggle between easily, like Clean Blue or Spotlighting. Or this one's kinda cool, it's very dramatic. The lighting I will use for my city night scene is the 360 option, but feel free to use whatever you like best. Now, right now the city is way too bright for a night scene. Let's tweak that, and you can find some useful additional option in the Additional Lighting tab. First, let's drop the brightness of the lighting down to around 5%. Cool, that's much better. It actually looks like it might be a night scene. Under the rotation twisty, you can change the angle of your lighting, and you can play around with these until you find something that looks good. Yeah, kind of like this one. There's still a little bit of blue lighting on some of the buildings, and it looks nice and dark without being too monochrome. Now, the next great option we will enable to make our scene look a whole lot cooler is Ambient Occlusion. Open up the Ambient Occlusion tab in the Effect settings for the Element plugin, and then tick the checkbox to enable AO. Now jack up the intensity to add some awesome shadows into the city scene. Looking good. I just love how much more ambience you get just by adding some ambient occlusion into your shot. Now let's add some glow to the city lights. open up the Glow tab and enable the Glow option. And that's it. Again, feel free to tweak as you please. I will leave this on the default settings for now so we can move on with the tutorial. Finally, because we are creating a camera fly-through, we want to make sure that the Element 3D motion blur is enabled, so open up the motion blur tab and ensure that the motion blur option is set to comp settings. This means that if we enable motion blur in our composition, Element 3D will also apply it to the 3D elements in our scene. Let's move on to creating the actual camera fly-through. Again, just to speed things up while we're working with the city, change the render mode of the Element 3D plugin back to draft. Now zoom out of the city so that we can find a good building that can be the target for our camera to enter. You want to pick a building fairly far towards the back of your city area to give you enough space to fly through the city for a little bit. Let's get a little bit closer. I think I see one that might work well for us. Yep, how about this one here? I think this one should work well. Next, we need to place the actual footage that we want to transition into right on top of this window here on our 3D building. This means we need to get the exact 3D location of this window so that we can position our footage layer correctly at the same spot. Fortunately, the Element 3D plugin contains a number of utilities that will make this a piece of cake. Go back into the settings for the Element plugin. Let me quickly close down the render settings so it's a little bit easier to navigate around. And then expand the Utilities tab. The plugin contains a tool that allows us to select a 2D location on our screen and generate a 3D location on the surface of the 3D model in our scene. To do that, click on the little target icon to select a 2D position, then go into your preview window and click in the middle of the window where you want to place your footage. Make sure this building window faces towards the far end of the city from where the camera will come flying in. Actually, let me zoom in a little bit more. I do want to make sure that we are as centered on the window as possible. So again, click on the little target icon and then click right in the center of the window. Cool! Now click on the Generate button under the Create 3D Null option in the Element plugin. And there it is, a null object placed right at the center of the window in the 3D space of our scene. Let's rename the null object to Window Null so that we don't forget what this one is for. Next, we need to align the camera so that it aims perfectly straight at this null object and at the footage layer that we will place on top of the window. For this, use the Pick Whip icon to parent the camera to the null object. Then select the camera and reveal both the position and the rotation properties. Now set all values for the orientation and the position properties of the camera to 0. The camera is now positioned exactly at the position of the window null object. If we now decrease the Z position of the camera, you will see our null object and the window coming back into the shot perfectly centered. Let's add the footage that we will transition to once the camera enters into the building through this window. I'm going to use the scene from the intro where you guys so rudely interrupted me during my late night snack. Drag the clip into your composition, and as always you can really use any clip that you want as long as it kind of looks like the scene was being filmed through a window into a room. Now let's position this clip in 3D space exactly at the position of the window. For that, reveal the position property on the null object and on the footage layer. Make sure to enable the 3D switch on the footage layer and then simply copy and paste the position property from the window null object onto the footage layer. Because the layer is going to be way too big for our little city scene, we will need to shrink it down considerably. So let's reduce its scale to, well, even 1% is still too big. So let's manually enter a scale of 0.2 and then we can just resize the clip in the preview window to fit over our building window. Let me quickly lower the opacity of the footage layer so we can better align it with the window. Cool, size-wise I think that will do. You will however very quickly notice that when you try to move the layer in the preview window, it moves way too fast and it will be hard to align it perfectly. This is happening because the scale of our city is actually very small, and so very small changes in the position value actually have a really large effect. I usually find it easier to enter very small changes to the position directly in the layer properties. So yeah, that kind of looks alright. Then, because the window is a lot wider and narrower than our footage layer, simply use the rectangular mask tool to cut the layer down to exactly fit the size of the window. Let me adjust the top edge of the mask a little bit and maybe bring the right edge in a little bit as well. Yep, that looks good. Open up the mask settings and add a little bit of a feather to the mask, maybe around 30, and bring in the expansion by just a few pixels to make the edges of the footage blend a little bit better with the window frame of the building. Cool, let's just bring the opacity of the footage layer right back up, and done. Now, that all seems pretty boring, but we have a really cool setup now. Check this out. Reveal the position property of the camera and then decrease the Z position to zoom the camera away from the building in a straight line. We can now zoom in and out directly onto the shot in the window. This will be how we will transition into our final shot. Zoom back into the shot so that we can only see the footage layer and nothing of the surrounding buildings or the window frame. Then let's go forward to about 14 seconds in, and because the footage layer isn't long enough, let's drag it across to time it so that at this point I'm just about to notice that there's someone in my kitchen. Also, because the layer now doesn't actually start at the beginning of our composition, let's quickly extend the layer with a time remapping effect. Simply right-click onto the footage layer and then go to Time, Enable Time Remapping. No need to change any settings whatsoever, simply drag the left side of the footage layer all the way to the beginning of the composition. Now let's finally animate the camera to create the actual fly-through of our 3D city. With the timeline indicator still at around 14 seconds, reveal the position and the orientation properties of the camera and add a keyframe to both of them. Then go back to around 6 seconds into the composition and then zoom the camera out quite a bit from its final location. Yes, we will pass through a few buildings on our way, but don't worry about that for now. Maybe that's a little bit too far. I think around here should be okay. It's a bit of a clear spot in the city which will work well for our purposes. Now, this next part will depend very much on the layout of your particular city, so please take the following instructions where we go and animate the movement of the camera as a guide only. You will obviously have to tweak this a fair bit so that it works with your particular city. I will move the camera over a little bit to the left to avoid flying straight through most of the buildings. Hey, I can actually see the final building window from here. But let's move the camera over to the right a little bit again, and let's also bring it down a little bit lower to the ground for a cooler effect. Make sure that at the current time we have keyframes for both the position and the orientation property of the camera. Then go back about a second and then change the orientation of the camera to point straight downward, which is 270 degrees on the x-axis. Go back another second, I'm now at around 4 seconds into my composition, and then zoom the camera all the way out of the city. If you zoom out too far, you will start to see the black area around the city, so let's zoom back in just a little bit so this top-down view of the city fills our entire shot. If we now scrub through our composition, we will have the camera dive down from the clouds into the city and then... this looks like where the sewers of the city should be. Now, you may be wondering why the camera ends up much lower than we specified with our keyframes. The answer to that question is keyframe interpolation. Let's quickly change the view for our preview window to... oops, wrong one. Let's change our view to right to see the entire scene straight on from the right side. With the camera layer still selected, you can now actually see the path that the camera travels during the animation, and you can see this huge dip it takes because it comes down from way above the city with a lot of speed. Don't panic if you can't see the motion path for your camera. Simply open up the preferences for After Effects, and under the display options you should find a setting to enable or disable the motion path. I always have this one enabled because it is immensely useful, and I recommend you do the same. Now back to our problem. Essentially the camera comes in way too hot and therefore overshoots this keyframe here that we already set. To fix this up, select the pen tool and then drag on the keyframe to adjust the bezier handles that control how the motion will be interpolated from one keyframe to the next. I want the ass end of this curve to stay above the ground for the 3D city. Let's switch back to our active camera view and scrub through the composition. Oh, much better. We are, however, still flying through a large number of buildings on our way to the final window. The other thing I noticed is that the camera looks upwards way too quickly at the start. I really only want the camera to start aiming towards the horizon once we are deep down in the city. So let's drag these two orientation keyframes forward a little bit in time. Yep, that looks better. And now let's deal with the problem of the camera flying through all of these buildings. Simply scrub to a time position where the camera is inside of a building, like this one right here, and then reposition the camera to avoid that building. Let's check this out. Yep, awesome! That single tweak was actually enough to avoid all of the buildings during our city fly-through. Another thing that I noticed is that when the camera comes down into the city, it gets a little bit too close to the ground right about here. Let's move the camera up by just a tad. Let's go back to the start and let's play back the first full version of our city fly-through. Not bad, you're starting to get the idea, but the camera movement is rather clunky and inelegant. In order to fine-tune our camera movement, we will use the graph editor that you have already seen in part 3 of this tutorial series. Enable the graph editor by clicking on this little icon right here and voila! There are the X, Y and Z coordinates of our camera animated over time. To allow us to create some more organic movement, let's first separate our camera dimensions with this little button down here. It's actually called, what a surprise, Separate Dimensions. Our X, Y and Z coordinates for the camera position are now separated and we can animate them independently of one another. First, select the Y position of the camera. Pull the Bezier handle for the first keyframe up so that the camera shoots down into the city nice and fast before it starts to slow down. Remember that this clip needs to match up with the shot from part 3 of this tutorial series where the camera enters the lower layer of clouds with a fair amount of speed shooting down towards the city. If we play this back, you can see how the velocity of the camera eases out as it sinks down into the city. I really dislike the way the camera orientation changes to look towards the final building, so select the orientation property next. See how the interpolation between these keyframes is really stiff and linear? Actually, we can remove the keyframes at the start, they're not really needed, so just delete those. Then select the first keyframe where the camera starts to rotate and click on the Ease Out button down here in the bottom. Looks better already. Actually, let me move the last keyframe forward just a bit so the camera rotation occurs a little bit slower. Then, with the final keyframe selected, click on the Ease In button to smoothen out the animation. Now play this one back. Much nicer. Still not perfect, but nicer. If we continue scrubbing through our composition, the way the camera moves towards the final building is really stiff. So now select the Z position property of the camera. And you can see that there are actually 3 keyframes here. However, the one in the middle isn't actually needed. It got added when we moved the camera to evade one of the buildings. So simply delete that one. Now again, the movement is very linear. To fix this, as before, use the Bezier handles on the keyframes to smoothen out this curve. I want the curve to come in slowly to make the camera accelerate just as the camera turns towards the final building. Once it nears the building window where we will transition into our final shot, I want the camera to slow down again and come to a stop gently. For this, I will flatten out the curve towards the end. I will also ease in the camera acceleration by smoothing out the start of the curve. Finally, I think I want the camera to start moving just a tad sooner, so I will drag the initial keyframe forward by just a little bit. Let's play this animation back. That looks so much better, but unfortunately we have screwed up the last part of our camera movement now because the keyframes no longer align the way they did before. Right here, when we have cleared most of the buildings, the camera drifts off rather strangely. This is caused by the animation in the X position of the camera. Go select the X position of the camera and in the graph you can clearly see the strange twist in the curve we have here. Again, use the Bezier handles and drag the keyframe a little bit if needed to smoothen out this part of the camera movement. I am going to start speeding through these tweaks a little bit because there's really nothing new here and it starts to take up a lot of time for this tutorial. Cool, that looks better. I think I will flatten out the curve just a tad more so the camera is aligned with the final shot a little bit sooner. With the animation for the X position fixed, I can see that the camera also comes in a little bit too high towards the end. As with the X position, I want the Y position of the camera to be aligned with the final shot a whole lot sooner. For this, I will reselect the Y position property, and in the curve towards the end here, the camera kind of glides up above the window a little bit. This again is happening due to keyframe interpolation, so let's simply delete the very last keyframe from the Y position of the camera. Cool, you can see that the camera now zooms away from the final shot in a straight line. At the start of the camera fly-through, I don't like that the camera is a little bit too high above the buildings now. As I keep saying, things like this require a lot of tweaking, and I will tweak this Y position keyframe here to bring the position of the camera down into the city just a little bit more. Let's also adjust the curve a little bit and check this out. Yeah, I think this looks good. Finally, I will go back and tweak the X position of the camera a little bit so that the shot aligns nicely with the final footage just after we're around the tall buildings on our right hand side. Cool, I'm actually pretty happy with the camera animation now. As always, remember to tweak until it looks good to you. One problem you might run into with Element 3D and zooming in very close to a model is the one I have right here. Notice how the building behind the footage layer has actually vanished, even though I have not actually yet passed through it with the camera. Right here is where the building suddenly becomes invisible to the camera. This is actually caused by the near clip plane for the camera and by the fact that the near clip plane is actually a little bit in front of the camera. Select the city layer, go back into the render settings for the Element 3D plugin and open up the camera cutoff tab. Notice how the camera near plane is not actually set to 0? Set it to 0 and bam! The building is back. Now return to the start of the camera animation and let's play this beast back. Yes, there's still more tweaking we could do, but let's do that some other time. Instead, let's now concentrate on finishing off our scene with the last few pieces that we actually need. First, let's change the render mode of the Element 3D plugin back to full render. It's looking pretty sweet. You will notice, however, that we have not yet added a sky. For the sky, I will use an image that comes with the Metropolitan pack, and the image is called Blue Night 4K. You can find these image files in the folder where you have the Metropolitan pack installed. Let me just close all of the properties on these pesky layers. Simply drag the sky image to the bottom of your composition. Let's scrub through and that might actually be all we need. Depending on how much you can see of your sky during your city fly-through, you may have to turn this into a 3D layer and span it across the background of your city, but I think we're in luck and I can use the layer in its simple 2D form to create a nice sky effect. The only thing I think we need to do is to add a hue and saturation effect to the sky layer and bring down the master saturation and the master lightness by just a little bit to blend the sky a little bit better in with our city scene. Let's check this one out. Awesome! Now for the final transition, I do want to have the footage that we are entering into with our camera look like it's glowing and blended in with the appearance of all of the other windows in our city scene. For that, search for and apply a tint effect to the footage layer. Use the color pickers to select a dark orange for the map black to property and set the map white to property to a bright yellow that you can see in your preview window. The effect is a little bit too subtle, so let's add a curves effect to the layer as well. Adjust the color curves to add a fair amount of contrast to the layer. Yeah, about there should do. Now search for and apply the glow effect to the footage layer. Adjust the glow threshold, the glow radius and the intensity to give the layer just a little bit of glow, similar to what all of the other windows in the city scene already have. Finally, because I think this is getting a little bit too orangey for me, let's apply a hue and saturation effect to the layer as well and bring down the master saturation a fair bit. Cool, let's check out how this looks. Let's also quickly disable the visibility of the window null object so it's not cluttering up our preview. Yup, much better, but the layer is still way too bright. It stands out really strongly compared to all of the other windows in the scene. To fix this, reveal the opacity property on the footage layer and then go to the time position where we are almost all the way zoomed into the window. Add a keyframe to the opacity at 100%. Then go back about a second or so and lower the opacity to around 30%. This will cause the window to appear fairly faint while we're flying through the city and only start to really brighten up just as the camera is about to enter into the final shot. Now obviously our final footage should not be all yellow once we're through the window, so let's quickly animate all of the color effects on this layer to fade out just in time. Go back a little bit to where the camera is almost at the window and then add keyframes to the channel range on the hue and saturation effect, to the glow intensity on the glow effect, to the curves on the curves effect, and finally to the amount to tint to property on the tint effect. Then go forward just a little bit and then neutralize all of these values we just added keyframes for. Set the amount to tint to value to 0, reset the curves to a straight line, lower the glow intensity to 0 and bring the master saturation back up to 0. Now play this one back. Bam! Looks awesome! The camera now properly enters through the window into the building and transitions into our final shot. Hold on to your hats, we are almost there. The last thing we need to do is add the bottom layer of clouds for our camera to emerge out of just as it dives down into the city. Let's go to the very beginning of our composition. At this point we want the camera to still be flying through the clouds so that this scene then fits seamlessly onto the one that we created in the last part of this tutorial series. For that, let's first zoom out the camera a whole lot more. Now, yes, you can suddenly see all around the city buildings and you can see the background sky image we added. No drama, we will hide that in a second. I was being a little bit sneaky and here I have a layer of clouds that I prepared earlier. It was created using the CC particle world effect and it is actually just a copy of the cloud layer from the last part of the series. I will not repeat myself here. If you want to learn how to create this cloud layer with particles, you can go and watch part 3 of this tutorial series. Let's enable the visibility on the cloud layer and let's drag it above the city layer. Now there are a few things we need to tweak. First off, I want to change the size of my producer. For now, let's simply reset the size to 1 for everything. Then jack up the radius X property to spread the clouds out horizontally. Also increase the radius Z property until the clouds cover your entire screen. Finally, set the radius Y property, the depth of your cloud field, to around 15. Cool, let's play this back. Again, this will very much depend on the particular settings for your particle cloud effect, but for me I can see that the cloud layer is way too thick. It's just a solid grey mass. To fix this, go over into the settings for the CC particle world effect and expand the particle tab. Lower the max opacity property down to around 3% so that the clouds look a lot more organic. Finally, I will also extend the length of my layer to make sure it remains visible until the camera has passed all the way through it and into the city. Let's play this back again. Yep, much more cloud-like. However, at this point, if I disable the cloud layer for just a second, you can see that the camera is already all the way down in the city. At this point, however, I want the camera to really be all the way out of the clouds layer so that we can get a really nice and clear shot of the city. To achieve that, you can simply increase the position Y property of the particle producer to move all of the cloud particles upwards until they are above the camera. Cool, let's rewind. Maybe the clouds are a little bit too high now. Let's push them back down just a tad and let's also condense them a little bit by lowering the radius Y property. You may have to tweak this a little bit to get it just right. Now let's deal with the fact that we can see the background of our composition all around the city grid that we have set up. Simply go to the time where the city fills the entire screen, which for me is around 4 seconds, and then reveal the opacity property on the city layer. Add a keyframe and then bring the opacity down to 0%. Move forward by about a second and then increase the opacity back to 100%. This will cause the city to fade in just as the camera emerges out of the clouds. Of course, we don't want to see the sky background image through the city while it's fading in, so let's trim it down so that this layer doesn't start until the city layer is fully opaque. Let's scrub through this transition. Cool, it's looking great. Now this is kinda cool. Let me quickly expand the cloud layer a little bit. The cloud layer is actually so low in my scene that I can see it hanging over the top of the city here during the fly-through animation. However, I think I'll actually just shorten it and cut it off just when the camera is out of the clouds and still pointing downwards. As always, this is really just up to you, but I prefer the city to be nice and clear for the final fly-through. Again, let's rewind and play back this first part of our composition. Very cool. The last thing, and I promise this is the very last thing for this tutorial, is for us to enable the motion blur. Enable the motion blur switch on your composition as well as on the city layer. Now, if you find that the motion blur from the Element 3D plugin looks a little bit blocky, you can actually always come down into the settings and under the motion blur options for the Element 3D plugin, you can actually increase the motion blur samples. I'm going to set this option to 16 to smoothen out the blur effect a bit better. Finally, rewind to the beginning of your composition. Let's not forget to enable the motion blur switch for the cloud layer as well. and play back your final city night fly-through effect. And that's all there is to part 4. Now we're almost at the finish line. In the next and final part of this tutorial series, we will put all of the pieces that we created together to create the final zoom effect all the way from outer space down into the city and into a building. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. As always, if you have any comments, questions or suggestions, just leave them down in the section below. If you would like to see more cool visual effects and filmmaking tutorials, make sure you subscribe to my channel, and I'd also greatly appreciate it if you could give this video a thumbs up, favorite it and share it with the world. If you want to get in contact or simply stay up to date with what is going on, you can also find and follow me on Facebook, Twitter or on Google+. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I will see you later.